Good evening. Thank you all for coming and going through the cold winter weather to get here. I'm Eileen O'Reilly, the president of the National Press Club and the managing editor of Standards and Training at Axios. First, I have a couple of housekeeping notes. We are expecting one more panel member, and hopefully she will come running in here after some breaking news. And everyone's going to check their phone now, but she's hoping to come in here a little bit later. So, and I want to give a quick thank you to the National Press Club and our nonprofit affiliate, the National Press Club Journalism Institute, for supporting important discussions such as this one. I'd also like to express specific gratitude to Cecily Scott Martin, who is a membership events and program coordinator and who helped organize this event. Thanks, Cecily. See you in the back. I appreciate all of you for joining us here in person as well as on the live stream. For those here in person, please write your questions on the cards at your seats. Print them legibly so I can read them, and bring them up here, and I will pose as many as possible to our panelists tonight. So let's get started. We're all here to talk about a big issue in our journalism industry, news deserts. I know there are a lot of different definitions for news deserts, so I wanted to be clear at the start that I consider news deserts to be both in regional areas that lost their coverage and in communities that continue to be underserved by media. Unfortunately, these news deserts are vastly growing. My Axios colleague, Sarah Fisher, who hopes to join us a little bit later, recently wrote a story on how roughly 1/3 of papers that were in existence in 2005 will be gone by the end of this year, which is horrific. And she will talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. But the reasons this is so important are many, and I feel they have a direct impact on our democracy. For instance, people do not have access to the information they need to make informed decisions. Leaders are not held accountable for their actions. Communities of color or underrepresented groups don't have their stories or concerns told unless a big event, mostly negative, happens to their community. And people live in their bubbles and are inundated with misinformation that fills the journalism void. And this is only going to get worse with generative AI. But there is some good news. There's a growing number of institutions, companies, and individuals who are trying to change what's happening and are testing out different models. In our first News Desert panel at the National Press Club, we spoke with some innovative academics who are testing different models that utilize their students, journalists, to help improve coverage of both their local towns or groups, such as Spanish language communities. We learned a great deal from the experiences of the University of Maryland, Howard University, the University of Kansas, and Florida International University. In our second News Desert panel, we spoke with 5 different media organizations who cover news both for and of communities that tend to be underserved by others. We had a great discussion with leaders representing the GRIO, the Washington Informer, the 19th, Telemundo Noticias, and Tribal Business News and Native News Online. For this third panel, I'm absolutely thrilled we have 5 experts on news deserts here with us today to talk about the impact they see philanthropies and nonprofit news organizations are having on news deserts. Let me introduce them. On the far left, Courtney Lewis is the Chief of Growth Programs at the Institute for Nonprofit News, or INN, which has a network of more than 425 nonprofit news organizations committed to public service. Courtney builds and advances programs dedicated to generating revenue and fostering diverse talent for a rapidly growing nonprofit news field. Courtney joined INN in 2020 to lead Newsmatch, which is a sophisticated collaborative fundraising campaign for journalism in the U.S. Newsmatch has successfully raised over $270 million for nonprofit newsrooms. Previously, Courtney led diversification efforts at a Detroit public radio station and was a marketing director for a bicycle manufacturing startup. Thank you for coming to us from Pittsburgh, Courtney.
Glad to be here.
Good. Next, Kevin Grant is a co-founder and chief development officer of the GroundTruth Project, home of Report for America and Report for the World, which are service journalism programs now partnering with hundreds of local newsrooms in 21 countries. Previously senior editor at Global Post, Kevin has led reporting fellowships globally, reporting for many places, and his work has been recognized with awards from the Edward R. Murrow, Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University, and Online Journalism Awards, amongst others. Kevin is also an adjunct journalism professor at Georgetown University. Thank you for coming to us from Central Virginia.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Tracy Powell is the founder of the Pivot Fund, which invests in BIPOC-led community news through funding, capacity building, trainings, and opportunities for collaborative journalism. Tracy also is the founding fund manager of the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund. She was a 2021-2022 fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and a 2015 to 2016 JSK fellow at Stanford. Thank you for coming to us from Atlanta, Tracy.
Thank you.
Amy Kovac-Ashley is the executive director of the Tiny News Collective, or TNC, whose mission is to support the voices historically excluded from media and media ownership. TNC provides the tools, resources, and learning community to help news founders build sustainable news organizations that reflect and serve their communities. Amy has spent 12 years coaching news organizations, executives, and journalists. Her work at the Lenfeld Institute for Journalism and the American Press Institute supported local news sustainability and improving organizational culture. She was also a journalism educator and administrator at West Virginia University and Georgetown University. In 2022 to 2023, she was a Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow when she authored the News Executive Leadership Transition Guide. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
Yes.
I'm so honored you all came here to share your perspectives and experiences so that we can all learn on how to tackle these news hazards. So I was wondering if we could just start off with each of you talking about, giving us a few minutes to describe your organization, when it started, and how it's making a difference. Do you want to start, Courtney, with that?
Sure, I'll start. So the Institute for Nonprofit News, or INN, actually started in 2009 by 27 independent investigative news outlets. It originally was really for investigative news outlets at the time. They were all nonprofit, but that was not really the center reason as why they gathered. In 2015, that changed because we were seeing something happening in the market outside of public media, which we know is well-known nonprofit model for journalism. There were these digital news startups popping up around the country. And so it changed to the Institute for Nonprofit News. Now we have more than 425 members, GroundTruth being one of them, among others. But I think what's exciting to see, we're talking about news deserts. Something happened in 2017 that we noticed in the nonprofit news sector. Between 2017 and 2022, which was our last data point, there's this huge spike in local newsrooms starting up. About in a month, there was a newsroom starting on average once a month for a period of 6 years. And that included local newsrooms like Gig Harbor Now in Washington. They started up as a result of their traditional outlet closing. Quintessential like news desert, traditional media is gone. Community members, previous employees of that organization got together and started up a newsroom. It also includes newsrooms like Kansas City Defender, which is kind of that second definition of news deserts. Kansas City Defender is an organization founded by Ryan Sorrell, who wanted to create a news outlet for Black Gen Z and millennials in Kansas City. And he has ambitions to expand that throughout the Midwest. And it also includes Connecta Arizona. They're out of Arizona. They're a cross-border outlet. But what's interesting about this local news startup is their main news product is not reporting. They actually distribute news and information through like coffee shop meetups, through text. And they're using different platforms to really build community and get people that are traditionally underserved by news, get them access. So it's exciting in terms of what we're seeing in the nonprofit news sector. People, it's not just the fact that people are starting up and replacing what was lost, but they're innovating and creating new models and new ways of serving their community with news and information.
Cool. What was the name of that last one, by the way?
Connecta, Arizona.
Okay.
Look it up.
I will.
Kansas City Defender,
Very,
yes.
very,
Gig Harbor now.
but both phenomenal sites.
Very cool. Kevin?
Yes, Kevin Grant, co-founder of the GroundTruth Project. We launched in 2014 initially to try to support the next generation of journalists around the world, especially knowing that so many freelance journalists were under threat, were being imprisoned, were being killed. And we actually lost a dear colleague, Jim Foley, when we worked together at Global Post. And going through that ordeal was one of the drivers to sort of commit our new nonprofit GroundTruth to supporting people like Jim. And we had a focus on reporting fellowships for a few years, worked in more than 50 countries, but to be entirely honest, we were employing more of a parachute model. It was often a mix of local journalists working with outside journalists, so I think there was a spirit of respect and collaboration, but we weren't entirely local. And it wasn't until really the 2016 election and all of what happened there that there was sort of an aha moment within our organization that the solution is in local journalism. So we really piloted, incubated Report for America starting in 2017. Tracy, an early advisor and continues to be an important advisor to RFA, started with 3 reporters in Appalachia, and over the next several years grew to 325 local reporters in all 50 states, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Washington, D.C. The model for Report for America and its sister program, Report for the World, is that we actually share the cost of creating new full-time local reporting positions with the newsrooms. We defer to their expertise, right? They know best. We are out sort of all over trying to hustle and put together resources. And in addition to providing certain types of editorial, professional development support to these core members who are full-time reporters of the newsrooms, we're also working with our partners to help them raise more funds to support these positions over time. So, as you mentioned, we're now working in 21 countries. Report for the World is still a bit of a little baby, but we're sort of incubating that sister program now, and just sort of really, really committed and in this work. So thanks so much for having me here.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you transitioned to the world? I mean, that's
Sure.
21 countries is pretty.
Yes.
It
So
doesn't sound like a baby to me.
there was sort of
Adolescent.
there was sort of a full circle moment for us because we had started at GroundTruth with this international reporting fellowship model with colleagues all over the world who, when we first launched Report for America, reached out and said, wait, when are you going to do this in Nigeria, in Brazil, in India? So we knew that the demand was there, and it was really just a matter of finding a version of the Report for America model that could be applied in various countries, and then adding a whole new sort of layer of difficulty, because as we all know, there are a number of countries that are incredibly skeptical. The governments are very skeptical of any outside funding. So we actually took a lot of time to figure out the model in India, because that proved to be one of the toughest places to first start. We found some, I'll just say, some good ways of partnering with with these newsrooms so that we stayed true to the law while also helping to support great public service journalism.
Very cool. How are you, Tracy?
First of all, thank you so much for having me
Of course.
here at the Press Club. I used to live here in DC, and it's just great to be back from hot Atlanta. So the Pivot Fund was launched in 2021, about a year after I left, almost a year after I left the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. To tell you why I launched the Pivot Fund, I have to go back a little more than a decade. When we started, we first initially, when I say we, I'm talking about myself and Jean Marie Brown, who's been one of my writing partner for a number of years. But we started seeing these emerging media organizations serving communities, particularly communities of color, because those are the communities that have long been ignored and, as you said earlier, maligned by traditional media. And so we started seeing these organizations popping up. And so I called them back then the New Jacks. These were the New Jacks on the scene when it came to journalism, and I wanted to better understand them. And the Gates Foundation gave me a little bit of money so I could do some research on these new media sites, mostly digital media sites. That was our very first research paper documenting this trend. And then came the white paper that established the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund. So that was a second look at these organizations, because now they were coming online and they were really having real impact. And so I wanted to find out how to deliver dollars and additional supports to these organizations to stand them up. And so that's when you saw other organizations like Report for America come online as well. And so in the second paper, I documented organizations like MLK 50, Sahun Journal, documented New York. And so I felt this urgency to get dollars to these organizations. And so we were either the first funders or early funders for all of those organizations. So the first cohort was 16 news outlets, and then the second cohort, it was about 20 outlets. And the money came right on time, because soon after they got their checks, the pandemic hit, and all the advertising revenue dried up, and so they had those dollars that they could look forward to keep them going, to keep them going. And then, of course, George Floyd was murdered, and so I recognized very early on that it's not just a check that they need additional supports. And so then the Racial Equity in Journalism Legal Fellow was born. We funded that to get free pro bono legal support to these organizations. When I was talking to Mukhtar Ibrahim, he was out in the field covering the protests stemming from George Floyd's murder. And I just remember him saying, what happens if I get arrested, right? And so I knew immediately we need to get some additional supports and other capacity to these organizations. And so we delivered those funds, but the pivot came about because I learned then that we needed to do more than just the check, and how could we get that? So I did another paper at Harvard. We did research about looking at the funding that did start going to these organizations and what kinds of impacts that money was having. And that paper was turned into Architects of Necessity, which was a peer-reviewed paper that I co-wrote with Dr. Meredith Clark out of Northeastern. And so that informed the way Pivot was structured. I understood that these news outlets needed general operating support, right? They needed transformational dollars. They did not need to be encumbered by additional requirements such as boot camps and accelerators and all this other stuff. We needed to get them enough money to hire at least 1 to 2 more people to really do the work and increase their influence in the communities that they were serving. So of course, Pivot was born to do just that. We initially funded 7 news outlets in Georgia. We are now expanding across the South. Our second cohort will be coming online soon, God willing. And then we are also expanding into the Midwest, looking at funding organizations there, but we need to do the landscape analysis first. We're really thankful to have a cohort of funders behind us backing that work. But I think it's really important to understand that in Georgia, where our first cohort is based, these are organizations that were not on anybody's radar, right?
Hyper-local, I think.
Hyper-local grassroots organizations, based, a lot of them based on social media sites, Instagram, and Facebook and so forth. And now even TikTok is a whole nother generation out there on TikTok. And so these organizations they had Facebook groups with thousands and thousands of followers. I tell the story often about ATL Scoop. It's a news outlet, media outlet in Atlanta, has nearly 1 million followers. When we first found them, they had about 500,000. And now it's almost 1 million followers on Instagram. And they're doing news. They're not just an aggregator. They are actually sharing stories, and then the people in the comments are adding context to these stories. So they're producing news alongside their communities. And I compare them often to the daily newspaper in our city with not as many followers, as subscribers as they have followers, right? I think I heard something, 120,000 subscribers, both in print and digital.
Wow.
So, yeah, as we see the traditional news model collapse, you do have the good news, you have others coming up, but the even better news is that they just weren't born. This is an evolution. It's been happening for a number of years, and we're some people are just now realizing it, but they're coming of age, and it's really, really good to see this next iteration coming on board now.
I love that. That's great. All right, Amy, how about you?
So all of these people are doing such wonderful work, and we all work together in various ways. I'm grateful, Kevin, by the way, for the shout out to DC. So I'm a district resident here, so we often get left behind when we talk about the states, so I just want to underscore that. So I am on day 11 of being the executive director of the Tiny News Collective, so important to note. But I have been a fan of it basically since its founding. And it was founded around the same time, actually, as the Pivot Fund. It came out of an idea and a hypothesis, really, from the three co-founders. So Aaron Pillhofer, Heather Bryant, and Tyler Fisher. We're really trying to think about some of the similar questions around how do you help early stage news founders with the things that they have to contend with, right? We've heard great news about the number of INN members that have been startups, and some that are now 10 years old or 12 or 13 years old, which is great. Right? It's great to have them be in their adolescent years. But a lot of them had to go through a whole lot. A lot of mistakes, a lot of tripping over a bunch of different things, because they're not just running the newsroom side. These founders are running small businesses, quite frankly. Whether their business plan is a nonprofit or a for-profit one, they are running small businesses. And with that comes a whole host of things that they need to be concerned with, which is not just the journalism. But they need to do things in order to support the journalism. So, Heather and Tyler and Aaron were coming together and starting to ask the question of what are the things that the early stage founders need to be successful, to sort of potentially leapfrog over some of those mistakes that other folks have made, or just the hard part about trying to figure out everything from scratch. And so, you mentioned the tools and technology. So we provide a basic platform for folks from a tool technology standpoint, so folks don't have to make this big decision about what technology to use, right? Because that often takes up a lot of time, a lot of money. A lot of these founders are not skilled necessarily into making those decisions. They have to ask a lot of other folks for support. And so that's a really big piece of what we provide, in addition to fiscal sponsorship. So one thing about folks when they start something up, they can't immediately become a nonprofit, right? Even if they know they want to be a nonprofit someday, they have to ask for that designation and apply for that designation from the IRS. So while if someone knows that they want to be a nonprofit, they need to be able to take in funds somehow. And there are funders out there who will only work with fiscal sponsorship, right? So we knew that there was a financial piece to this as well, to help them be able to take in funds from all kinds of places, including the Pivot Fund. And so fiscal sponsorship is part of what we provide. We also provide access to lawyers around a whole bunch of things, not just the journalism side of things, but also things like, what's my privacy policy, right? Like, how do I actually do this in a way that is setting me up for success?
Or how to write a contract.
Yeah, all those things, right? We have some founders, there's one right now in Minnesota, actually. It's called the Optimist Project, and she is thinking about, she does a lot of photography on her site, and there's a question about, people have come to her and said, well, can I use your photos? And she's like, yes, I don't know. She's having questions like that. And there's also potentially a business opportunity for her there too, for her to sell her photos to certain types of folks, and to other folks she may just give them to them with credit and things like that. So there's really like basic but fundamental issues of starting up a news site. And I think it's really important that what we're trying to do is really provide those building blocks for folks so that they can focus on serving their audiences, which is really what this is about. And a lot of those folks are coming from a similar background that Tracy was talking about. Folks that have, historically have not really been served by media and have not been part of media ownership. And that's a really important ethos for us, that like we want to help these folks with their own ventures. So we're not taking, we don't own their sites with them, right? They are members of the Tiny News Collective, and we provide resources to them and all of these other things. We fully expect that when these folks are successful, that they will graduate from the things that we are providing, and they will move on to the other resources that are out there, including things like NewsPack, which is a CMS that a lot of news organizations use, but is not necessarily made for early stage founders. So we're very focused on the early stage founders. And the other part of it is the community of learning that they bring together. Mm-hmm. So it's really hard to be a founder by yourself. Like if you've ever started anything, right, and you're the only one doing it, it's lonely and isolating. And so what we're trying to do is, in addition to these tools and resources, we're bringing this community together so that they can learn from one another. We can provide them with resources to come in to talk about a whole bunch of different things and give them advice on in different areas. But really the hope is that they are building sustainable news organizations that will continue to serve their communities and start to fill some of these gaps. There's gaps of all kinds, mm-hmm. Not just when the traditional newspaper leaves, but as you described, lots of communities for eons, it feels like, have not been served. And so this is really an opportunity to help start serving those communities from the ground up. And I think that's a really important thing that we think a lot about. And we've done some partnership with some places across the country that I'm really excited about. We have a partnership with the Wichita Community Foundation, which we did an info challenge, and basically said, folks out there in Wichita, what are the news and information gaps that you have and you want to help fill? And so folks applied to this program, and they chose 3. And so there are 3 sites now that are members of the Tiny News Collective, brand new members. We just onboarded them. I met some of them for the first time, I think, day 4 of being the executive director. And they are covering everything from the entirety of the arts scene in Wichita to the very deep and growing Latino community there. And we're providing the resources to them as early stage founders, together as a small little cohort, but also bringing them into the fold with the rest of the Tiny News Collective members. We were on a call recently where, I don't know, there were like 3 or 4 different sites that all were thinking about the arts. And it was so interesting because most of those folks said on the call, I've never been on a call with journalists where I'm not the only one who's talking about arts and culture. And how important that is to my community. And so it's really cool to be able to have that space for them to talk to one another about the things that they're facing themselves and that their communities are facing. So one last comment before we move on is that I think it's really important to be able to provide these types of services and also to find pathways for funding for them as well. So part of that partnership with the Wichita Community Foundation is that community foundation not only helped us find those founders, they know their folks better than we do, right? We're a national organization. They serve their city, but they are also providing funding some seed funding to those founders as they get started. And that's a really important part, as Tracy was saying, to getting these folks up off the ground and getting them to their next stage. So it's a very exciting time, actually. There is negative news about the growth of news deserts, but I think we have to look for those bright spots, and we have to, if I can quote you back to you, we have to fund the new. She said that on a stage like about 3 months ago. But we have to fund, and I would add support the new, because the new is what's going to be the legacy news organization 20, 30 years from now, and we need them, right? We all need them. even if I need them in Wichita, even if that's not serving me, because we as a country need everyone to have access to quality information and quality community connection, which I think is something that's been lost in many different ways. So with that, I will cede my time.
So I'm glad Sarah Fisher has been able to join
Perfect
us.
timing.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was late.
No worries. We know how breaking news works. So Sarah Fisher is my colleague at Axios. She is the senior media reporter for us, as well as a media analyst for CNN. She authors a weekly newsletter called Axios Media Trends that reaches more than 100,000 professionals. Sarah was named to Mediaite's most influential and new media list for 2022, as well as to the Washingtonian's list for the 500 most powerful people in Washington, D.C. in 2022 and 2023. She's also worked for the Washington Post, the New York Times. I consider her a subject matter expert on all things related to media, so I'm glad you joined us, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. And Eileen has edited that newsletter many a time.
A very light edit, so no. So thank you for coming. We were just talking about what each organization and is doing right now and what they're up to. So do you want to? We can step back for a moment. Do you want to give like a quick, big picture look at what you see happening in the industry itself?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big trend has been that more outlets, but particularly local news outlets, are leaning into nonprofits and philanthropy models and are trying to engage their communities a lot more, something you were speaking about, in order to finance their outlets. There was a time when, especially in print, advertising was a smart way to subsidize news content. And as the internet grew, big tech platforms took more of that share, and suddenly advertising became much more competitive. There was a big trend, particularly leading up to the Trump administration during that 2016 campaign, of news outlets leaning more into subscriptions. I think people were craving political news. That trend has sort of started to subside. We've seen news outlets struggle to continue with the same level of momentum in subscriptions, and that's made reader revenue through things like memberships and donations much more important. And that's why being in a nonprofit model is really important, because you can solicit donations from foundations and big philanthropies more than ever. I'd say where we stand right now, though, is philanthropy has shifted in news. There was a time when big billionaires were coming in and they were buying outlets. You saw this with the LA Times, you saw this with the Washington Post, you saw this with the Atlantic. You saw this sort of happen the other day with a big Sinclair executive buying the Baltimore Sun. What I think has shifted is now you have local philanthropists who are buying into or paying into funds that can help support a local newsroom. We're seeing this in Cleveland, we're seeing this in Indianapolis, we've seen this in Houston. And I think that's a healthier model. One, because it's never good to have one person unilaterally writing a ship, but then two, because it's more sustainable. If the billionaire of one of these big papers no longer decides they're interested, they just sell it, and all that momentum gets lost. But when you're contributing into a fund, if one philanthropist decides to pull out, the entire ground does not shift underneath that newsroom. And so I'm excited and looking forward to more models that look like that.
Really interesting. What do you all feel about what she just said, as far as
May I add just a little bit?
Yeah.
So something that Report for America has been working on is what we kind of term community news funds. And we didn't coin the term, we don't own it, but we have been facilitating conversations among a number of communities where typically it starts with a community foundation and one local newsroom saying, let's pool together some resources and start getting more overhead revenue into this newsroom. Let's start hiring both on the business side and on the editorial side. And let's really activate and energize, right? Lots of local donors, more community foundations, and get something going. And what we've seen is there are about 25 of these funds nationwide, you mentioned a few, that are starting to raise significant revenue with local ownership and more sort of methodical decision making around how this revenue goes to newsrooms in an equitable way. And we're starting to see, even with the rise of Press Forward, and I imagine we'll talk a little bit more about Press Forward here while we're here, but there's a really important conversation. I know Pivot Fund is leading a big part of this about how can this big money be spent well, and we think that part of the solution are these community news funds. So just wanted to second what you were saying.
And that's also similar to the sort of Wichita Community Foundation taking an interest in news. And they're one of the most, I would say, advanced from that perspective of community foundation, because they're also helping with their local press forward. I think we'll see more of that happening, and there are places across the country that we should be looking at and learning from as people are looking for ways to set up these types of funds.
Sarah, I think you're absolutely right that these as funds, and as some total transparency, as someone who runs one of those funds, I think that it's important that those dollars aren't used to replicate a system that we currently have, one that we know is failing. And so when I look at some of the work that's being done, I'm happy to see local funders taking ownership of local news. But I sometimes worry that the funds that are being created are not community-centered. There's a difference between community foundation-centered and community-centered. A lot of the community foundations that I see look a lot like a lot of the newsrooms that we've had in the past. They look very affluent, very white, very educated. But the folks that funders are trying to reach may not have all of those attributes. The people who have been underserved and feel left out and forgotten aren't as educated or aren't as wealthy as those community foundation folks. And so it's really, really important as we see more of these funds come online that they are reflective and representative and responsive to the communities that they want to serve, the communities that have not been served historically.
I just have a follow-up to that. I could not agree more, and I think this has traditionally been a problem for some of our public media, the NPRs and the PBSs of the world. They take on corporate money that is not necessarily reflective of the communities being served, and as a result, the types of projects being underwritten don't resonate necessarily or fill the need of the people who are consuming that media. And I think one of the real promising things that I've seen is there's efforts now to get local people more invested in the funding. So in DC, for example, there was 2 council members that brought a bill to the floor. I don't think it will pass, but it essentially gives tax subsidies to people so they can choose where they're going to fund the news themselves. And when the money comes from people truly at the local level, the editorial content addresses their needs better, as opposed to a corporate funder. You know, they have a message about climate change, right? So they're going to sponsor a climate sustainability vertical. Like, that's important and that's great, but maybe that community doesn't need that as urgently. Maybe they need much more coverage of food scarcity in their community. So that's why I think, to your point, the funding really, really matters coming from the whole hyper-local level.
And the hope, go ahead, Courtney.
I'd like to underscore that this is all exciting, that people are coming to the table and wanting to support journalism, but this is a very new habit and a new behavior. And so you're seeing a lot of people come to the table, but in the conversations I'm having, there's still work to do to tie the thread between reporting and impact in everyday lives of people. And what we found to be more compelling is reporting that is sort of taking the ethos and the spirit of quality journalism with integrity and repackaging it and reformatting it to be more consumable, to be more meaningful, to be more personal to their community. I always say, like, you talk to philanthropists and they could not imagine divesting in the arts. They could not imagine divesting in libraries, maybe. That's kind of debatable these days. But like, you couldn't imagine divesting in the arts. And journalism needs to reach to the esteem of the arts. Like, this is a public good and a community asset. I think there are still conversations that we're having with funders that might sound like they are subsidizing a failing business model, and it needs to really transition to generating philanthropic support for a community asset, a public asset. That work is on us to do. Like, the messaging, the impact, the value of our journalism is for us to prove. in order for that message to translate. The other thing I'll say is, I always say, like, we need more funders at the potluck. There are a lot of funders that are coming to the table that care about the fourth estate. They care about journalism, they care about democracy, but there are many, many, many more funders that care about other things. They care about childhood education, they care about the environment, they care about these things that are not sort of a one-to-one with journalism. And that's really where the opportunity lies, is to figuring out how journalism can be redefined to have greater impact across issues, across communities, across places. I mean, that's the exciting
How
thing.
journalism can be useful.
How it can be a
How it can be
utility.
useful.
And that requires not just funders to write us a check, but it requires us to change and evolve as well, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
The other thing I'll note is that I'll just underscore, I think the strongest model of a nonprofit is pulling from foundations, is pulling from individuals in their community, is pulling from small businesses in their community. We see the local nonprofit news model, the pie looks like 45% from foundations. There's like 35% from individuals, mostly high net worth individuals. But there's still a quarter of money coming from sponsorships and advertising, which is interesting to see in the local nonprofit model. So there's, I think, the more diverse your pie can be, the more stable your newsroom can be, and to deliver what it is you're trying to do is really creating that stability comes from the diversification of where your money's coming
Revenue
from.
streams. Can
Yeah.
I push back just a
Yeah,
little bit? Y'all
course.
know me. We're talking a lot up here about nonprofit journalism. I just want to say that every journalism startup, every BIPOC newsroom is not, or every new community newsroom period is not nonprofit. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model, right? And so when you got a lot of newsrooms thinking, oh, there's a ton of money out there in philanthropy, we're going to get some of this. No, there's not, right? There's just not. It might be a lot of money out there, but when it comes to nonprofit journalism, there's not a lot of money out there for nonprofit journalism. So, and we've seen some nonprofit newsrooms have to go through some tough things recently. You know, we saw Texas Tribune have to lay off people. We just saw the Houston Landing, one of the organizations, they just had to lay off people. The city in New York going through changes. So nonprofit is not the end-all, be-all. And a lot of BIPOC newsrooms don't want to be bothered with nonprofit for a lot of different reasons, right? The paperwork is a pain. Responding, they don't want the government in their business, so becoming nonprofit is like having to deal with the IRS. They ain't trying to do that. So they want to remain for-profit organizations. That's where, Tiny News Collective comes in play in terms of, being a fiscal sponsor. But it's just very, very important that we understand that tax status does not equal sustainable journalism.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's more than a tax status. I mean, I represent
I'm not trying to put down time in, but I'm just saying we got to be realistic. We have to have a conversation about it.
It is a tax status. It does create an opportunity for some access to certain types of revenue that for-profit is harder to have access to. But there's also governance structures. There's also ownership structures that are very different in a nonprofit versus for-profit. I think what is absolutely the truth is that markets are going to need different things. Nonprofit is not the end-all, be-all, but it's a piece of the pie, and depending on the community and the market, it might make sense for a nonprofit to exist, or for-profit, or both.
I just don't want folks to leave here thinking that's the only answer out there.
Of course, yeah.
Totally agreed. If I can just say as middle ground here, Report for America has helped a lot of for-profit organizations, including a lot of the black press across this country, start to tap into philanthropy as one revenue stream.
Exactly.
So it's not an absolute, and in a way, if there is philanthropic money available, why leave that money on the table when it doesn't necessarily have to be that hard to get if you have the right partners?
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's where, the nitty gritty of fiscal sponsorship, which is something that I deal with a lot. I was having a lot of conversations about it today, but that's again one of those very important building blocks to having a business, right? Even if someday you will be a nonprofit, you're not going to start out that way. You need certain resources to get you access to different types of funding.
Okay.
And that's where, it's important to have, for us, it's not just we're sort of like serving in this role and we kind of keep an arm's length. We have these folks who are members of ours, we know what they're going through, and we're able to advise them a little bit about different things, right? So we're talking now about, it would probably be better for them for small dollar donations, for someone who's not going to get a tax break, for them to just give that money to them directly, for them to explain like what it is. And that doesn't have to go through us necessarily, right? Like keep as much of that as you can. But for larger dollar things like grants and other things like that, that's where you need a fiscal sponsor, where oftentimes that funder won't give the money to someone except if they are have nonprofit status. And we are in a position, because of who we are and who we're representing, to be able to say, we're doing this on behalf of these folks, and we really care about this, and we're going to be good stewards of that money that will end up going to these people.
Pivot supports both for-profits and nonprofits. So there is a way for funders to do this and do it well and do it the right way. It's just that not all funders have the capacity.
Right, none of them are set up that way.
Pivot is different than traditional funders. Will support a for-profit organization. We just have to structure the grant in a certain way to make sure that those dollars are being used for a charitable purpose, and we see journalism as a public good, so we're able to support organizations like that. So there are different ways that those for-profit organizations can be supported. I'm not saying that nonprofit organizations are bad or anything. It's just that we want to be sure that we acknowledge those organizations that are not and don't plan on becoming a nonprofit entity to also get support.
I want to go, go ahead.
If we find some middle ground, I think it's not any nonprofit, it's not any for-profit, that there are shared values on.
Yes.
Whether you're for-profit or nonprofit, that you're serving your community, that there's, transparency and measures in place to ensure that the work is, the journalism is done well. And that that's really what's more important.
Right, it's like it's the mission base versus what I think has like been the corporatization and the consolidated sort of role that we've seen the media sort of go into, but now we've got more independence, right? And I think that is also a big piece of this as well. But I wanted to go back to something that Sarah had said. I think it's really important that we also think that, and all of you sort of mentioned this, but there's an unevenness about who's getting the money, right? One of our founders has a really great idea, was in line with what a particular foundation was asking for. I read all of the specs just to see, like, yes, this makes sense. And she said they didn't give me this grant because they said I wasn't part of the mainstream media. And she's been doing this work. She has a legit site. If you go there, you'll see it. She's been doing real reporting, but because she didn't have that, whatever that stamp is that particular funder was looking for right now, they weren't going to give her the money, right? Or at least that's what they said. But I think it's also part of all of our jobs to also advocate for making sure that funders, including a lot of funders who haven't given a lot to journalism, know what the landscape is and where they should consider investing their money.
I want to know that newsroom.
I'll tell you offline.
Okay.
I don't want to out her here.
This is what Pivot specializes in, right? We are specializing in these organizations that, quite frankly, aren't on anybody else's radar, but they may not want to be part of what we call our established professional journalism. I mean, one of the folks that we invested in when I was at Reg was Push Black and Julian Walker. And I remember having so many conversations with Julian. Here's an organization that is Facebook Messenger based, or it was before Facebook decided to deprioritize news, but Facebook Messenger based, and they were doing a series, a story about, you know, these instant messenger posts about states and how they were purging voter lists. And it was fascinating. You had to keep clicking next to get to the next part of the story. But then at the very end, you clicked and they said, check your own status, right? Check your status to make sure you're still on the voter rolls. And so they had a tool that took you to your local county election office, and you could put in your name and all that kind of stuff to check and make sure you're still on the voter rolls. This was public service journalism. Yet the founder was like, I'm not a journalist, don't want to be a journalist, right? I don't want to be one of y'all, right? Because that's our reputations, I'm sorry. Lawyers have better reputations these days. And so he just didn't, but the thing, I was like, you're producing journalism. And that was an organization we funded, even though he denied us. It's an organization that I funded because he was producing public service journalism. Some of these folks don't want to be considered. One of our current organizations, Apostle of Oaths, I talk about them a lot. Elizabeth Galarza is the owner. And when I met her, we did our research, we identified her. When I met her, she was just like, why are you here? Why are you talking to me? Because I'm not a journalist. I don't have a journalism degree. I don't even have a high school diploma. And so when she said that, I just felt tears coming to my eyes. I was just like, because you are producing critical news and information for Spanish-speaking residents in this community that they can't get anywhere else, right? You're telling them how to stay safe when a hurricane is headed their way. You're, telling them how to access vaccines. You're telling them, how to get driver's license. This is public service information that they needed, but you're also creating opportunities to engage with the community, doing more than just providing information, but just helping them to navigate their lives, creating a community that they really want and need. So then I turned the question around to her and asked her, why do you do this? If you're not a journalist, why are you doing this? Because you're not getting any money, right? Getting very little money. And her response to me was, I want to understand why the system doesn't work for everybody. And then tell them that so that they can go about the business of changing it. And that is why a lot of these folks are in the business doing this, right? They want to have that kind of real impact. I can tell you, since we invested in Apostle of Oaths, they produced stories about a mobile home community, more than 800 immigrants living in that mobile home community, didn't have access to clean water, and at least not consistently. They produced a series of stories. That community is now hooked up to the municipal water system because the city officials, the mayor and everybody else called them in and said, how can we get y'all to stop writing these stories? And now this is how you get us to stop, make sure you get clean water to this community. They have been reporting stories about police stops that they felt were disproportionately targeting Hispanic immigrants there, to get them deported. That led to a lot of deportations, I should say that. And most importantly, they acquired another newsroom. Now, this is an investment of $150,000. I didn't know she was gonna go out there and acquire another newsroom. I just wanted her to do more of what she was already doing on Facebook and try to move some of those people off of Facebook onto her own platforms. Mm-hmm. But because she was having so much impact, she was able to acquire another newsroom in Charleston, South Carolina. So now they have this, I call them like the power, they have this like the whole Georgia, South Carolina coast now that they're covering. There was a journalist who was the publisher of the paper in South Carolina, and the paper was not profitable, so they were able to acquire it. And now, it's kind of an outsized impact, right? Just for $150,000. Some of these newsrooms Sarah was talking about earlier, Sarah, they're not just getting $150,000.
Oh my God. I think Houston got $20 million?
Right, yeah. Right, exactly. And so, but just with that small amount of money, they're really, really having an outsized impact, and that's the potential, that's the opportunity that we have here in front of us.
Yeah, and so important about what Tracy's saying is that some of those stories came from what I would call things that traditional journalists would look their noses down at, right? Things about basic understanding of how to get information or where to vote.
Yeah.
Some of these things that we call service journalism, if you go, even today, if you go into some larger traditional newsrooms that have been around for a long time, those jobs are not the jobs that they're not the big investigative reporter job that I'm this important person, right? It's oftentimes younger folks and folks of color and women who are in those jobs doing those things, but they're highly important, right? And we saw that during COVID, but somehow, still, the idea of service journalism had become, it's sort of a denigrated kind of part of the business, but it's based, those folks wouldn't have been able to do that work about the accountability stuff without the basis of understanding what their community needed and providing them with really important, vital information.
If I could just quickly summarize, I think journalists cannot afford to have our noses up right now.
Correct.
And neither can funders.
Yep.
So, there is a lot of possibility, I think, to keep having these conversations that I know, Tracy, you are leading, but to start to change some of these definitions across the philanthropic landscape. We already know that audiences get it, right? A lot of audiences don't give a darn if it's a journalist or a non-journalist, doesn't
That's
matter.
right.
It's just,
Yeah,
is
they
this
don't pay
good
attention to that.
information? Is this good material that helps me in my life?
Yep.
Yeah, it's very good. So we have a bunch of questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can. A lot of them are about funding and money, which is very important. Here's one. The discussion about avoiding the funding of business models that we have seen fail. The competing objectives of funders make one think about how community funds will choose who gets the money. Do you see governance and funding decisions staying at the local level, or do you see alliances forming and more uniform standards going into existence?
So I think that's for me. The Pivot Fund engages in what we call participatory grant making, and also trust-based grant making. And so we are trying to inform the rest of philanthropy on how to do this and how to do it well. So what is participatory grant making? We start from the very beginning by going directly to community members and asking them, who do you trust for news and information? Where do you get it from? How do you access it? And then what do you do once you have it, right? So we're involved in the community right from the very beginning, but we don't stop there. When we send out a bunch of LOIs after community members have identified
Say what
these,
an LOI is.
I will. So then we come back to the LOI. So we ask them who you trust, and then we're vetting that organization, making sure that they are producing, journalism, civic news and information that adheres to universal journalistic standards, right? It's not propaganda, it's not disinformation, misinformation. It's real information that the residents, citizens are using. Then we send out an LOI, a letter of interest or a letter of inquiry. Would you be interested in talking to us so we can learn more about you, right? And you can learn more about us. That's when Elizabeth was like, who are you and what you doing here? And so we send out that LOI, and then we have a review committee, look at all of the LOIs. So we're going through that process right now. And so they look at the LOIs, and they're really helping us vet the organizations. On that review committee are people from the community, right? It's not just funders. It's not just, journalists. There are people from the community helping us decide who you're going to invite just to submit a proposal, right? And then once they submit a proposal, we do have a review committee that's, again, includes community members, right? Folks who are just like them, helping us decide at what level, well, first, if we're going to fund them, and at what level, right? So that's participatory grant making. And then again, the trust-based grant making is when you see a funder, you vetted them, you've looked at their business model, looked at their business structure, looked at the market that they're in. Can the market sustain this? And we say, we trust you. we trust you to take this money and do what you say you're going to do with it. I'm not going to make you go through an accelerator. I'm not going to force you to go through some boot camp. I'm not going to make you become a member of some organization where you may or may not feel comfortable. I'm just going to write you a check. And then I'm going to work with you hand in hand to connect you to my friends over at Report for America or Tiny News Collective so that you can put this money to the best use, right? And so that's what I mean by Pivot's not a traditional funder. We actually work in partnership with these organizations to ensure that they are successful, and then introducing them to some of the folks that we know who are part of the establishment, if you will, established journalism ecosystem, to help them leverage that money to do the best work that they can do so that they can graduate to bigger money. They can have that diverse revenue stream that Courtney was talking about. They can get Axios' attention and we'll say, look, here we are down here doing really powerful work. I mean, that is what this is about. It's not that they want to get accolades and awards. They really do, seriously, want to serve their communities with news and information that their communities can't get anywhere else.
What happens if that backfires? Like, does it happen at all, or?
Yeah,
Sure.
it's not easy. This work
Yeah.
is not easy,
Yeah.
right? When I say we work hand in hand, like, you know, we're probably going to have to go down to a community and say, hey, not everybody is fundable. Let me just say that. Not everybody is fundable. Mm-hmm. So we may have to go down and work a little more hand in hand with somebody. The Pivot Fund, again, not traditional. We have gone out there with that publisher and said, let me help you find the person with the skills that you need for this newsroom. We've helped them hire salespeople for their to sell advertising so they can generate advertising revenue, right? Not every funder is going to do that.
Or has the expertise.
Or has the expertise, You're right. And then, I mean, we invest in, we have a TV station. She's in 600,000 households in Southwest Georgia and part of Alabama. One of the first things she did with her money was hire a sports editor. Now, some funders would look at that and they would have gone crazy. I was like, oh my goodness, what's she doing? But she's in a racially divided community. She's already trying to bring she was already bringing people together on her platform. But that sports coverage allowed to do that even more, to deepen that bond or relationship between white folks and black folks in her community, bringing them together around that coverage. So then when you channel that other news in there and through that vehicle, they're not arguing with each other about stuff that really, at the end of the day, they don't have any control over, right? They're finding that they have more stuff in common than what divides them. And I had to trust that founder to know how to bring that community together and then how to best deliver fact-based, credible news and information to that audience is coming together. It's been fascinating to watch.
That's interesting.
But no, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you gotta get your hands dirty. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I've had to, staff has to go and support and like, look, this is what you need. Let me help you write the job description.
Right.
And you hope you never have to ask for the money back, right? Like,
You hope you never have to ask for the money back.
But I think there's like a mentality that has to shift too. Mm-hmm. This is all exciting, but it is also very new and also very unknown. And there's a certain amount of risk that investors, funders, founders have to have in doing this. And I think when there is failure, what I've seen happen is that the whole network, it resounds and people learn from it. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of like Tiny News Collective. The concept is like people have started up and they've stumbled and they fall. Yep. So let's right size this. Let's make this easier. So when there is failure, I've seen it really turn into an opportunity to right size, evolve, correct. Because there's no silver bullet.
We learn
right
from
here.
failure, right? That's how we learn.
And we need to be more willing to
We
do
need to
that
do that,
in like more public spaces,
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
because some of the things that you mentioned, Tracy, about what happened last year in a couple of newsrooms. I think people were upset when they read the stories because they didn't feel like they actually understood what was happening and what the problem was, because so many people looked at those news organizations as the model of whatever it was. And they were like, but if you're the model and you're having these problems, what does that mean for those of us who aren't the model, right? And so to be a little bit more transparent and also to kind of own that role of the public, like being more public about how things are going. There's a way to, you don't have to air dirty laundry, but I think there are ways of bringing both the community in, because there's also the community might have a lot of questions about what is happening at this news organization, but also the community of journalists in the industry is wondering what's happening too. So more transparency around failure and to reframe it perhaps as an opportunity to learn.
Well, I also wonder if there's something we're all learning, which is that eternal, perpetual growth and a rapid, eternal scale-up is not possible, and maybe not even desirable. So, whether it's Texas Tribune or even looking at our organization, Report for America, we realize we can't just grow infinitely, and we need to be focusing on what are we doing, what is the impact we're having, and then sort of build around some core goals. Rather than maybe get blinded by scale, knowing how big the problem is, you can only do so much just running at that speed. You're going to run out of gas.
I love what you just said. Rally around core goals. And I think that's really
And
important.
values.
Because, and values. Because we invest in hyperlocal community news and information. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Yep.
There just isn't.
And that goes back to, so for us, again, we will be very excited for any of our members to sort of, again, graduate if and get larger if that makes sense for their community. If it doesn't, we're happy to have them for as long as they want to be our members, right? And as long as they're getting value out of working with us. But I think the grow forever, like that is not sustainable.
It's unsustainable.
And it actually, you end up making poor decisions about what your business should be doing, and that's when mission creep happens, and then you lose sight of your values. And so news organizations also need to be thinking about those things from the ground up, from the very early stage of founding, on. And have to really stay true to what they're trying to do and what their mission is.
That reminds me, since we only have a few more minutes, I'm afraid we'll have to get to some questions privately maybe, but I think maybe the last question should be, what would you consider success for each of you?
Why don't we start on this side? Is that okay?
I think as a reporter covering a lot of these updates, what would be considered success is if I have more stories to write in 2024 than I did in 2023. I'm not saying I didn't have a lot, but there was this boom time coming out of the pandemic. We had federal subsidies. We had people opening up their pockets to communities because of the pandemic, that I was overwhelmed by the number of stories I was writing about this topic, and then it sort of subsided because this economy subsided and people closed their pocketbooks, and that's a natural contraction. But I'd love to see it get bigger next year.
We've been talking a lot about money. I feel like success to me would be audience, where you're seeing more people consume news, a broader diversity of people consuming news at different education levels, different ages, different languages, and that be a result of the form of news changing to adapt to them versus the other way around. And then I think inevitably, when it is valuable to more and more people, you can think of a million funding opportunities, philanthropic, non-philanthropic, like whatever, but the value has to be there for people. And that would be success.
I'm going to keep it at the people level too. I'm going to say that success is the students I teach or the core members that go through Report for America, college and university students, young people who aren't going to college for journalism at all. There are more jobs in journalism or journalism adjacent roles that they can feel good about, that they feel like are in line with their values. They actually are sort of doing the work that they want to be doing in their community, in their country, in their world, and they're not being asked to sort of run headlong into a buzzsaw of misery, which unfortunately sometimes I'll just say I feel like I'm coaching some of my students to do that. And I'm desperately trying not to, but inadvertently helping to usher that along. So that would be my goal. Good jobs that are people-oriented.
We're looking at success at a couple of different levels. So success is that mobile home community accessing water because of this journalism coverage. Success is generating $100,000 in new revenue because the newsroom's been able to hire a digital sales manager for the very first time. Success is audience growth and getting on engaging folks in new ways on new platforms, whether that's a podcast or launching a new newsletter or a series of newsletters, or through Instagram, and not yet, but we're trying to look at TikTok and how we're going to make that work. But anyway, it's engaging people in news, with news in lots of different and creative and innovative ways, is supporting more collaborative partnerships. Happy to say that I'm seeing the budding, or I'm not sure if there's a solid partnership here, but a budding relationship between ATL Scoop and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where I'm seeing AJC content being shared on ATL Scoop, but also understanding that we are creating news alongside our community members. The other level that I'm looking at in terms of success is, last year I went to Media Impact Funders, which is a large organization of funders, and the entire conversation was about redefining and reimagining journalism. For me, that's success, because I remember sitting down at a table full of funders having the conversation like, we're going to have to reimagine what journalism is. We're going to have to ask community members how they define journalism. So having, changing some of the conversations among funders, seeing more funders adopt participatory grant-making models would be success for Pivot. Seeing more trust in founders, right? Particularly founders who you're not used to working with as a funder. That, for me, would be success. So we're looking at changes in philanthropy, but also changes in who is served and how we serve them with news and information.
So I'll piggyback on the trust. I think, all of the research that's been coming out, Pew does this all the time, Pew and Gallup do these surveys. I think, a bigger picture for us is that trust in very local journalism, we actually start to see those numbers start to rise. While local journalism generally has had more trust overall, as opposed to national journalism, the numbers still aren't great. If we want to be really honest, we can say local journalism has more trust, sure, but if you're comparing to really low numbers, it's not that great. It's better, but not great. And so I'd love to see those numbers start to rise as there are more and more local outlets that are being built from the ground up. The solopreneurs that we help, all the way up to and including the folks that are members of INN who have been around for 10, 15 years, right? We want to see the work that these people are doing for and with their communities start to see changes in the way that actually people behave and think about what they're doing and become more engaged. On the community level, I think it's really important for people everywhere, quite frankly, to be able to see themselves and see the different types of stories, not just negative news about their community. Somewhere they can see that. They can see themselves in the work that people are doing. And I think that's why it's really important to think about sports or the arts or all of these other things that make up our lives, and that's another way to connect with people. So that's another measure of success, that people are actually seeing a higher level of connection and community engagement. And then I think, Courtney, you started with audience. And I think that that's another piece of this. We have not brought up the topic of news fatigue, which I think is interesting. That
We're
we
tired of that.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about it.
But I would like to see, again, on that engagement perspective, like for the folks that we work with to be putting things out there that are actually bringing people back into a space where they are seeking out news and information. That would be a really big piece of success for us. And then finally, like internally at TNC, we want to be able to help founders make the decision about what's the next thing that they have to do, what's the next decision that they need to make, what's their first hire, right? So if
Exactly.
we can help them make those decisions and they can sort of plot out the way that they're going to strategically build their businesses, that is success for us and that is success for them, and it's a shared success.
That's great.
Yep.
Well, thank you. So this has been very informative and inspiring. I think, yeah, as we all know, news deserts is such a horrific thing that we're all facing, but seeing the activities and actions you all are taking to address those is really, inspiring and important. So I really appreciate you sharing your experiences and your perspectives. And I want to thank all of you for all your questions and for coming here tonight in the cold. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.